So the beginning of the next unit gets into what we've been learning about with colonial America in Unit 1 and leading us into the fact that the colonists here in this new world are going to start getting put in the middle of a battle that's raging in Europe between two superpowers, being Great Britain and being France. So we're going to get into how the colonists get in the middle of this and how they respond to it and their loyalty to England and what that does. And that leads us to the French and Indian War, but also with the idea of the Native Americans and how they get involved and how they actually decide to take sides to one side, or the other. So, in order to understand how the French come to the New World in the first place, we kind of got to talk about French exploration. In the early parts of Unit 1, we got into the fact that Columbus sailed in 1492, and then that kind of led the way for other explorers from other countries to start to explore this continent of North America. The French this is going to be the story of the French and how they start to expand their holdings, even though when they first explored the area, that was not their goal. It was not about conquest of land. It was more about taking from the land the animals for fur trading, the fishing, the trapping, all those commodities that they could get from the land that they could sell back in Europe. Eventually, the French will start to explore more and more of the land and explore more and more of the waterways, and that's going to lead them to conquer and not dominate, but conquer a lot more land that they have control of. This is going to annoy the British because the British feel they have claim to the entire land, even though they're only in control of 13 colonies, which border up to the Appalachian Mountains. So we're going to start our story basically back in the 1600s because the French were exploring the New World as early as the 1500s. But the 1600s is when they start to actually take claim to a lot of the areas that they're exploring. Again, their goal in the 1500s is more about taking the land, not conquering the land. So they start to settle areas further north than the British do, and they start to settle the areas of what we now know to be Canada. And the one waterway that they're going to explore is going to be the St. Lawrence River. And as you see on the map here on the screen, it's this area right here. That's going to lead down to other waterways like the Great Lakes, the 5 Great Lakes, and then eventually down to the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. So those waterways are going to start to create this large chunk of land within the middle of this new world that the French are eventually going to take ownership of because they're the ones who would have explored it first. In 1608, the French will establish Quebec, and this will be the new capital. This will be the capital of New France. So all this area up around Quebec and up basically of Canada is basically considered New France because of the exploration and the conquering of the land, conquest of the land. In 1663, New France is going to become a royal colony. So the French are going to decide that, okay, this land now belongs to France. So New France is going to be a territory that surrounds the St. Lawrence River. And again, it's going to be beneficial for them for the different commodities that they want to trade. And trading is going to be very good for them, especially in the fur market. Now, the St. Lawrence River in Canada is going to lead to the Great Lakes. But then the Great Lakes, you're going to see later on, is going to lead somewhat to the Mississippi River, which is our largest river. So when the French discovered the Mississippi River, they thought what they were finding really was a waterway passage to the Pacific Ocean. So 2 men by the name of Joliet and Marquette will explore the Mississippi River to a certain point. They think they're finding a pathway to the Pacific Ocean. Once they realize that the river is not traveling west, it's actually traveling more south, they stop and they turn around and they head back to New France. So a few years later, a man by the name of La Salle will basically will take the exploration that Joliet and Marquette did and work his way basically down the Mississippi River, claiming all land around the river to be for France, and basically find a passage to the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico leads to the Atlantic Ocean. So now you've got a port, and that's why he creates New Orleans at the end of the mouth of the Mississippi River. Now you have a port where you can trade and you can take goods from Europe across the ocean and travel to the Gulf of Mexico and then up into the middle of the country. So La Salle basically creates this land around a New England, Louisiana. And Louisiana is named after Louis XIV, which he is the Sun King.
So he is the one that's so Louisiana is going to be this huge territory in the middle of the New World, and you guys know Louisiana to be a much smaller state today. So obviously it's going to get shrunk down at some point. But all the land that's being claimed by the French, so they have two colonies now in the New World. They have New France and they have Louisiana. So I kind of jumped ahead a slide here, but I'm not going to go reset all that because that was actually good work, good information. Anyway, so this is just a map of the Louisiana and New France territories. Like I said, De La Salle was going to be the one who's going to follow the river all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And like I was saying here, the Gulf of Mexico is going to lead to the Atlantic Ocean, which then leads to trade outside of, or trade with Europe from the New World. So it's another way to get in. Remember, the British colonies are bound, their boundary is the Appalachian Mountains, okay, which are very tough to climb over and traverse. So you can't really bring a whole lot of goods to the middle of the country and actually explore a lot of the middle of the country when you've got this huge mountain range in the way. So the Mississippi River allows that, allows the exploration and the carrying of goods and services, good and manufactured goods to the middle of the country. So France loves to have this commodity. So New France begins to grow, and the map starts to get a lot larger. So again, the colonies of New France and Louisiana, they basically just call it all New France, is going to be the land that the French are going to have control of. To the south, there's Spanish claims. So the Spanish and French are actually allies to each other when it comes to the French and Indian War. So they're going to basically make agreements on, what land is theirs and what land is the French. The British have control of the 13 colonies. And again, that goes as far as the border of the Appalachian Mountains, because again, it's very tough to get over the Appalachian Mountains. So New France is made up of settlements along the St. Lawrence River all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, one of the questions in the worksheet that I gave you was about why did the Americans align themselves more with the French than they did with the British? Well, there's a number of different reasons. When the French took the land, or at least conquered the land, we'll call it conquering, even though it really wasn't, their goal with the Native Americans was to kind of join their tribes, assimilate with them, learn their cultures, learn their languages, but not to be an over-dominating force. The Spanish over-dominated, the British over-dominated, the French did not. So Native American tribes liked the fact that, like the French, because they were not kicking them off of their land. And since they were joining their tribes and learning their customs and learning their languages, and even some of the fur traders, heads of the fur trading companies, were marrying women of Native American descent, that started to make that alliance between the French and the Native Americans, which I know is one of your questions in the worksheet. So in the 1700s, the Great Britain and France are going to be the two superpowers of the world, pretty much. Because if you think about it, we go back to the 1500s, Spain had the Armada. The Armada was the most dominant force, and Spain was claiming all of this land. Spain sends the Armada to England, and England defeats the Spanish Armada. So England is now a more powerful navy and a more powerful fighting force. The French, at the same time, are also a pretty powerful force, especially if they're claiming more and more land in North America. So Great Britain and France are going to basically be the two superpowers of the 1700s. They're going to be the strongest empires, and they're going to constantly compete with each other for wealth, for land, and that's all around the world. That's not just in the New World. That's in the Caribbean, and that's also in India and parts of Asia. So Great Britain and France are going to compete a lot for domination. They want to dominate the world and be the more powerful empire than the other one. So they're going to constantly in the 1700s come at war with each other, or start wars with each other. Now, in the New World, beyond the 13 colonies and beyond New France and Louisiana, in the New World, the most sought after land that the British wanted, that the French claimed ownership to, was called the Ohio River Valley. So the Ohio River Valley is basically the Ohio River and all of its tributaries and all the land that surrounds the tributaries. That's considered Ohio country. That's considered Ohio River Valley. It all starts here in western Pennsylvania. Okay, there's a city here you guys know of today to be called Pittsburgh. There's three rivers that merge. Pittsburgh's called the Three River City because the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio combine and meet there. So the Ohio will lead its way as the border of what we know to be Ohio today, and Indiana and Kentucky, and then eventually the southern border of Illinois, and it will connect itself with the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River is the longest river that goes north and south. So the Ohio River Valley is the area that's going to connect whoever owns it with the Mississippi River, which connects to the Gulf of Mexico, which also, again, encourages trade to occur between Europe and the New World. Okay, and that's going to be one of the more dominating forces. So the British sought after this land thinking that was theirs because of all they do was go west, and the French who explored the land basically declared it to be theirs. So this is going to be in the French and Indian Wars we talk in the 1750s. This is going to be the most sought after land, and where a lot of the wars are going to take, or where a lot of the battles for the war are going to take place. So in the 1740s, with the French and the British not liking each other very much, they're going to go, pretty much there's going to be little skirmishes between them off and on. The French are going to start attacking British forts. And what they'll do, and their whole goal is to push the colonists and push the British pretty much out of the Ohio River Valley. So they're going to start attacking those forts that are closest to the Ohio River Valley. They'll start stretching into New York, a little bit into Maine. Again, a little skirmishes here and there that don't start the war between the two factions, between the two countries, but it's one of those kind of dynamite pieces that eventually will explode and the two countries will be at war. So since the colonists and the Native Americans are inhabiting to this land, the France and Great Britain have an issue to deal with. And the biggest issue is going to be the Native American tribes. Both Great Britain and France know that with the Native American help, that's manpower, and that can help to control, the domination of the New World. So both France and Great Britain want the Native Americans to kind of join their sides, okay, to ally with them. The French are going to get more and more Native American tribes to join with them because of the reasons that I gave you before. The fact that the French, when they first settled the land, they weren't kicking the Native Americans out of the land. When they lived among the tribes, they learned their languages, they learned their cultures, so they really weren't forcing them out. There was also French missionaries that were converting a lot of Native Americans to Catholicism. And as you guys know from our story of England and the Catholic Church being kicked out of England to switch to the Anglican Church, Catholicism and Protestantism are going to be two religions that are going to be causes of war between two different countries. England and France are going to be a good example of that, because France is Catholic, England was once Catholic, and then Great Britain becomes Protestant, which was Anglican, but the Puritans helped to reform the church. There was the Protestant Reformation. So most of the national church of Great Britain is going to be the Protestant church. So that's going to be another sticking point between why the British and the French don't like each other, because the religions are different from each other. It's going to lead us to a conversation as well later on about how religion can't be part of government and how they need to be separated from each other. That's going to be part of our Constitution discussion later on. So these are the reasons why the Native Americans will start taking the French side more than the British. But I'm not saying that all Native American tribes will take the French side. There's going to be a confederacy of tribes that are going to take the British side. We'll talk about them in a little bit. So in the Great Lakes region and upstate and around New York State, guys, the picture shows you this is what New York State looks like today, with Lake Ontario basically being the border right here. There are 6 different tribal nations. They make up what's called the Iroquois Confederacy. So you got the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, Seneca, and there's one with a T that I can never remember the name of. And it's so small in this map that I can't even read it to you. These 6 nations are called the Iroquois Confederacy. So that's part of your worksheet as well. They are going to basically send representatives. They represent their tribes. And representatives, almost like a representative government, these 6 nations will unionize each other, will combine and basically speak for the entire Iroquois Confederacy. They are going to stay neutral for the longest time. They are going to basically trade with both the French in the Great Lakes region and with the British in the colonies region. So they're going to stay neutral. Then sometimes, because of their trade, they're going to pit each other against each other. They're going to pit Great Britain and France against each other more often than not. Eventually, though, the Iroquois Confederacy has to decide which side they're going to face, because they know that war with France and Great Britain is imminent, and it's going to definitely be fought in the colonies. So the Iroquois Confederacy starts to trade, or its leaders decide to give rights to the British. And that's going to give the British their pass to say that the Iroquois are going to be on their side. So the Iroquois Confederacy is going to be on their side. So the mid-7th, like I said, they came under great pressure as the British moved to the Ohio Valley. Eventually, the leaders of the Confederacy gave certain trading rights to the British and reluctantly became their allies. This is the most powerful tribal nation confederacy of nations in North America. And because it's so powerful, it gives a power boost to the British. The French have the Huron Indians, or Native Americans. They have the Delaware, the Algonquin, and there's another couple of tribes that you'll see in the video clip as we see in class that are bonding with the French. But the Iroquois Confederacy, being as powerful as it was, decides to align itself with the British, and it gives the upper hand to the British, and eventually will give them the victory in the French and Indian War. So we talk about the Native Americans being involved. What about the colonists? The colonists of the 13 colonies have pledged their loyalty to England. Most of the colonies are now royal colonies, and their governors are appointed by the king, and their upper legislature is appointed by the king. So the majority, and Virginia being one of those royal colonies, basically is what's going to lead Great Britain to kind of start the fight back. So the colonists are going to be forced to align themselves with the British, because they're colonists of Britain. Their loyalty is to England and to Great Britain. So they're going to start to fight for the British. They're going to be given jobs in the colonies to actually help fight for the British, even though Great Britain is not going to commit their forces from Great Britain for a little while here, for a couple of years into this. So in 1753, the governor of Virginia, the royal governor of Virginia, now remember again, appointed by the King of England, basically will put a surveyor in charge of a special message that's got to go to the French from the British. So that's surveyor, 21-year-old George Washington. He is going to basically be assigned the task by the governor of Virginia to basically go tell the French to go away, to get out of their land, that they are trespassing the land and they need to leave and vacate the Ohio country, the Ohio River Valley. Again, most sought after land by the British especially. The French believe they explored it, therefore they have claim to it. The British believe, well, that's western part of our colonies, so therefore that's our land. So in 1753, the Virginians will actually start to want to settle the Ohio Valley, and George Washington is sent to the French to tell them to leave. Basically giving the British terms to the French about demanding that they're trespassing and demanding them to leave. The French don't agree, don't listen, and they kind of just ignore Washington's claim. His message does no good. So this is going to start a cascading effect from Great Britain, that Great Britain is going to then start charging the governors with taking action. So the governor of Virginia, basically, when Washington returns and gives the message that the French are not leaving, Washington is given his first command. The governor basically makes George Washington, now 22 in the spring of 1754, a lieutenant colonel. That's a pretty high rank in any army. So he makes him a lieutenant colonel. 22-year-old makes him a lieutenant colonel. And basically gives them 150 men that they call a militia. Now, a militia is the colony's way to create their own localized army, basically. That's what a militia is. So it's localized citizens that are armed in terms of emergencies, to fight in emergencies. So this claiming of the Ohio Valley, the governor of Virginia sees to be, because Great Britain is seen to be, a emergency. Right? This is where you're going to start seeing a little bit of the split between the colonists and the British, that the colonists are fighting Great Britain's battles. They're not going to like that, especially when Great Britain doesn't commit to the war right away. So George Washington leads 150 men up into Pennsylvania, what we know now to be Pennsylvania, along the Monongahela River, okay, because the goal of this militia is to set up a fort at the Three Rivers Post. So the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela, what we now know to be Pittsburgh. It's not Pittsburgh yet. They don't call it Pittsburgh yet. They want to set up a fort there, basically a trading post fort, so that they can use the Ohio River, so they can trade, they can continue the business that they want. Well, so when Washington starts to make his way up the Monongahela and up towards where they're going to set up this fort, he finds that the French have already done that. The French have already created a fort there, and they called it Fort Duquesne, which is also listed on the worksheet. Fort Duquesne is the French fort at the same location that Washington and his men were going to build a fort as well. So Fort Duquesne is basically run by the French. They set up that fort a while ago, and it's a pretty big, exclusive, well-guarded, well-armored fort that's been created there. Washington, not looking to go back to Virginia and give up and tell the governor that he failed, basically decides to tell his troops to create a fort that's a little further south of Fort Duquesne. And that's going to be what he's going to name Fort Necessity. Now, this fort is going to be very quickly built, and it's not going to be very strong. It's not going to be well armored. You're going to see a video clip where the Native Americans will help in a way, and then when Washington decides he wants to attack the French, they're going to back out and say, nope, we're not helping you attack the French. So you're going to see that in a video clip here in these slides. So Washington builds this Fort Necessity, which is pretty much a shamble of a fort. It's more of like a post than anything else. It's not well guarded. It's not well defended. So Washington did not really, again, doesn't want to go back to Virginia to tell the governor that he's failed, takes these 150 inexperienced military men and decides, well, militiamen, and decides to attack the French. So even though Washington is outnumbered and overpowered, Washington decides to attack the French. Again, the French are well armored. They are more of a military force. Okay, these are armed military compared to the militia that citizens that Washington is bringing. The French quickly overpower Washington's troops and get them to surrender. So Washington is no match. This is Washington's first failure, is the fight at Fort Necessity, between Fort Necessity and Fort Duquesne. The French capture the British soldiers, and then they decide to send them back to Virginia. Washington returns to Virginia with his men, the ones that are still alive, and basically writes out a whole ordeal of the plan and basically publishes his whole ordeal with the French. Washington fails at Fort Necessity, but his failure actually starts to light a spark within the colonists and within Great Britain. They're going to start seeing him as a hero because he's going to strike the first blow. Even though he was overpowered and outmanned, he still struck against the French. This is going to make Washington a hero in the British minds. So after Washington's published defeat at Fort Necessity, colonists representatives from different colonies start to come together in New York, in Albany, and start to plan an idea of, we know war with France is coming. How are we going to prepare? How are we going to best prepare to fight against a very powerful force being the British? Now, again, being the French. Now, remember, these are colonists. Okay, colonies that they're pledged loyalty to England, but England isn't exactly donated all their forces to say, okay, we're going to help defend, our claim of land. They will, they're not yet. 1754 is what we're talking about. So a man by the name of Benjamin Franklin starts to put together a plan at this. He's a representative from Pennsylvania. He starts to put together this plan for the idea of the colonies that they really should unionize themselves. They should actually gather and come together to help themselves fight against the French. So Benjamin Franklin comes with this plan that's called the Albany Plan of Union. It's agreed to by the representatives of the colonies that are at this meeting. So all the representatives thought that this was Franklin's best plan, that the colonies should all unite together so that they can fight against the French. That is his overall goal. So he calls for a unionized colonial government. Not just one that's just not that every colony is running themselves. They're all run by one centralized location. This will eventually be the plan when they fight against the British in the Revolutionary War, but in 1750s, no colony is in agreement with this plan. So all the assemblies, no assembly from any colony agrees to Franklin's plan. So the Albany Plan of Union is basically dead. There's no colonial government. All the colonies will govern themselves. They didn't want to give up the power that they had as separate colonies. So Franklin, very frustrated and angry, creates this quote. Says, everybody cries, a union is necessary. But when they come to the manner and form of a union, they are all perfectly distracted. It means that Franklin wanted the colonies to unite and be one force to fight against the French and the Native Americans that were joining the French. The Albany Plan of Union also calls for the Iroquois Confederacy to join the British side, and they will, but it's still not, the colonies themselves are not going to be enough of a force to overtake the French and the Native Americans. So Franklin creates this picture of the colonies, which is on your worksheets, the second page of the worksheet. So I'm going to have you guys interpret this worksheet. I'm going to ask you a couple questions to go along with it. But it's based off this quote that Franklin puts. So we will talk about that in the coming days.